historical answer of the left has always been, we're different in many ways, but we have common material interests against a small group of people at the top who have different interests. The fact that it's not white and German doesn't mean that they're automatically allies of the left. And just being against racism doesn't make you an ally of the left. And magazines like Bahamas, which is now, I would say now is just an openly far-right magazine, but at the time was ostensibly a left-wing magazine. I remember the first issue I ever saw had an article, a critical Marxist defense of the English Defense League.
It's just weird. I actually feel like they have inverted some of the ideas of National Socialism. So rather than seeing Jewish power everywhere, they see anti-Semitism everywhere. It's this same paranoid mentality.
Because of the defeat of 1933 and the German working class's failure to rise up in revolution, which, you know, most leftists still thought was going to happen late into the 1930s, that, you know, this will go on for a couple years, but the proudest workers' movement on earth isn't going to allow itself to be crushed by this Austrian midget.
It's left here, and I was like initially, oh, it's cool, they've all got tattoos, we can like smoke joints in like these left-wing spaces. And then I realized like, yeah, everyone's white. And when I started to dig a bit deeper, it's like, okay, everyone's really pro-Israel. For this conversation, I spoke with Lauren Balhorn, editor-in-chief of Jacobin Mag, who is a member of the Left Party and something of an expert on left-wing politics. He's been involved for many years, and we discussed the role of Palestine in the German left, the so-called anti-Deutsch movement, I call them the ultra-Deutsch, as well as what possible prospects the Left Party has. When we recorded this, the left was on 4% in the polls, but it seems to have popped up recently, 6%, some even showing 8%, as well as a groundswell of momentum. So I think it's a really interesting viewpoint and a moment to look at it. And with the election just around the corner, let's stay tuned and stay mad. Okay, welcome to another episode of Mad in Germany. I'm James Jackson, and I'm here with the editor-in-chief of Jacobin Germany, Lauren Balhorn. Hi, Lauren.
Hi, James.
So thanks for coming on the show. We're talking in December. I'm really curious what you think about the left party, the left project in Germany. I think we'll get into that a lot this episode. We've recently had 2 new leaders elected, and one of them was actually your predecessor.
Yeah, that's right.
Ines Schwerdner, who is the former editor-in-chief of Jacobin. I mean, do you think that's a career model for you? Or no, I'm kidding. How do you think this new leadership is? Are they off to a good start?
I think the party, in terms of, coming from a very difficult position, trying to reorient around a few basic economic demands and kind of tightening up the message a little bit, avoiding the kind of cacophony of contradictory positions that has been kind of the public face of the party for the last decade probably. I think they have made a decent first start. At the same time, obviously, the polling numbers don't look very good, and I think we're just in a moment politically where the political momentum is very clearly on the right, whether it's the center right or the far right, and that puts, I think, any left-wing party in a difficult position because, especially if you're at a marginal kind of 3, 4, 5% position in the polls, a lot of voters who are thinking strategically or rather tactically. Are going to think twice about whether they want to vote for a party that may not be represented in parliament after the election. So I think it'll be, no matter what the leadership and the party does from now until February, I think it will be a difficult uphill slog. What I do find positive in terms of what Jan and Ines have put forward so far is there seems to be some clarity around the idea that the election isn't the end of kind of the process of rebuilding the party, but the beginning. And I think that's absolutely vital to have a medium to long-term perspective because the situation is bad and the situation has been bad for quite a while. And I think it will take pretty serious long-term party-building orientation in which elections play a very important role, but they can't be the be-all and end-all of politics. And in that sense, I feel like she has made a positive contribution to changing the conversation within the party.
You're known for your quite honest criticism of the Left Party, I would say. How did things get so bad in the last years? Was it all about this split between the Wagenknecht gang and the Kipping gang? Or is that from a few years ago,
I mean, I think, the problems of the party, you can kind of look at different levels. I think there's, kind of like superficial problems that like oftentimes the PR and communications of the party were not particularly great. They weren't, not that they were unprofessional, but they weren't cutting edge necessarily. I think if you look at...
You mean the Kita Not Bombs kind of posters? Because I always quite liked those.
I actually haven't seen that one. That one sounds pretty good. But in terms... For example, things like I'm not someone who thinks politics is reducible to communications, but I do think that it took a very long time for the party to kind of really grasp social media. I don't know if they have now, but it's certainly a lot better than 5 to 10 years ago. So there's that level, which I think has to do with institutional questions, the lack of dynamism of the party apparatus, which has various reasons having to do with the party's origins in the East German state. For one thing, but also the fusion process in the 2000s. I think there's also a kind of a bigger problem of which the split with Wagenknecht is only a symptom, which is the absence of, what academics would call a theory of change. That there wasn't clarity over what the party's actual role in the political system is. Is it kind of a principled fundamental opposition, which the party did quite successfully in the mid to late 2000s? Or is it kind of a left-wing corrective to social democracy, which on face I think would also be a noble goal if that's the horizon of your politics. But I think we had a series of governments throughout the 2010s, well, actually already beginning in the late 90s under the predecessor party, the PDS, where the party entered government always as a junior partner, always as number two to the Social Democrats, and was not really able to leave much of an imprint, right? So, I think maybe the most dramatic example is the government in Brandenburg. Die Linke was in government with the SPD for, I want to say, a whole decade, or at least very close to a whole decade. Sure, there were small corrections here and there, maybe a little bit better social policy in one category, a little bit better education policy somewhere else, but everything happening underneath basically German government orthodoxy, which is no new debt. And so you have a situation then in which ostensibly Socialist Party is going along with things like anchoring the debt break in the state constitution, which I'm sure, I wasn't there, but I'm sure the SPD said, this is the condition for governing with us. Do you want to go for it or not? And you can make a good argument that maybe that was the right decision at the time because the party had received, 20-something% in the elections and your voters expect you to govern when you receive such a good result. But with the medium to long-term effect of making the party simply indistinguishable from its center-left competitors. And now, Brandenburg is looking at, for the first time since reunification or since Brandenburg existed as a state, of not having Die Linke in state parliament. And I think you can make a pretty clear case. Of course, ultimately it was Sarah Wagenknecht who took a large part of their electorate in the elections. But I would argue that is kind of a knockoff effect of 10 years of not being very clearly distinguishable from the rest of the center left and no longer having kind of a unique selling point. We could talk about this for hours, but I think all of that goes back to the party forming as a shotgun marriage between two different political formations with very different historical trajectories and backgrounds and political cultures, and the party never succeeding in really unifying that into a common political culture and a common strategic perspective.
Was that the East and the West, basically?
Yeah, it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but yeah, basically. You have the West German Social Democrats, leaving the social SPD in the early 2000s, joining with the PDS, a successor to the East German ruling party, both of which are coming from essentially what you could call parliamentary or reformist politics, but with very different trajectories. So the Social Democrats leaving a party of government in disgust at the labor market reforms of 2003, 2004, and essentially seeking to be a protest vote against that move to the right. And the PDS, a party that until fairly recently could easily take home a quarter of the vote in the eastern states, but most of the time was still treated as persona non grata by the rest of the political parties, and that creating, I think, a very perhaps understandable desire to finally play with the big boys and girls, so to speak, and govern states and run ministries. Just from the very beginning, I think a real clash that was mediated or papered over in the first years simply by the fact that no other political party wanted to govern with them. Berlin being the exception. Berlin obviously has a specific political history and culture, but as long as there was no prospect of joining government, everyone could kind of get on board with the, I would say, populist-ish. I wouldn't go so far as to call it populist, simply because other populists have done that much better, but a kind of popular...
Not that popular for being popular.
Indeed. But if you look at, for example, the 2009 campaign when the party got almost 12%, its best result until today.
They were like the third in that election, right? Like, I think they were the official opposition, maybe?
That was actually, I think, the election afterwards. Where although their result went down, other parties' results all went down so much that they became the official opposition.
Yeah.
The leader of the opposition.
Yeah.
Crazy
situation.
Very crazy situation. Yeah, absolutely. And, when all the boats were rising, so to speak, I think the shared success papered over a lot of those unresolved differences. And as soon as, that upward trajectory basically had stopped by 2010, 2011. Then you had a long period of stagnation. The 2017 result was a little bit better than the 2013 result. But on a state level, results have been going down continuously since around 2010, 2011. And those differences increasingly came to the fore. And I would say absent a strong leadership, a charismatic leadership that was able to, kind of not only paper over those differences, but lead the whole party in one direction. And so you essentially had for 10 years at least two different parties coexisting in one shell, kind of sabotaging each other in some ways.
Right. So you effectively did have a charismatic leadership figure within Die Linke who was popular on a national level, and that was Sarah Wagenknecht. She was the Fraktionsvorsitzende?
Yes.
Which is like the parliamentary party leader.
Right.
And, gets a huge amount of airtime and there was always this debate, right? Like, who would do better if they split up? Like, do people vote for them despite Wagenknecht or because of Wagenknecht? From my perspective, it seems like, Wagenknecht's kind of won the argument there. Although the BSV is like on level polling nationally with Die Linke, depending which poll you look at, because it's higher in some of them. But on a state level, they've performed much better recently, and they've hit the ground running with this kind of really enviable momentum for a left-wing party. Although the question of whether they're a left-wing party, I think, is
open,
very much right? So why were some people in Die Linke hostile to Wagenknecht? Where did this kind of trench warfare come from?
There was this 4-part documentary series about like who is Sarah Wagenknecht. And I thought that was really interesting because it also discussed the 90s when I did not live in Germany yet and was, even if I had, would have been far too young to follow politics. And it kind of documents her rise as essentially some kind of unreconstructed Marxist-Leninist. She has a very interesting article from 1993 explaining the failure of East Germany, where you see that she really knew the political debates of East Germany and came down very hard on the kind of anti-reform, kind of hardline. I don't want to use the term Stalinist because she was too young to have anything to do with that, but defending Walter Ulbricht and kind of the 1950s and 60s generation. And in that moment, she became, for obvious reasons then, an icon of kind of the unreconstructed far left in the party, which were mostly older, East German, I would say true believers, for lack of a better word. And that obviously...
Nostalgia, kind
Yeah.
of political nostalgia.
Yes, but people who lived and worked and believed in the GDR, as opposed to people from our generation who never experienced it, wearing GDR tracksuits, which more power to them. But I'd say it's a different level of politics.
Sure.
And I think in the 90s, that was simply very unpalatable to the mainstream of the party that wanted to become acceptable, to become mainstream. Didn't mean that they wanted to abandon left-wing politics, but they didn't want to be associated with East Germany. They certainly didn't want to be associated with Leninism. And I would argue in many ways didn't really want to be associated with Marxism or weren't even really interested in Marxist ideas. So that made her obviously very problematic at that period in the party's development. That's why she was kind of unceremoniously booted off to Brussels for a while to be a member of the European Parliament, kind of keep her away from Berlin and away from national politics. And as her position shifted, as she kind of shed some of the Marxism-Leninism, she became a more, I would say, broadly liked figure across most of the left wing of the party, both East and West Germany. Although if you read what she was writing at the time, she has a series of books on economics, and really already 10, 15 years ago, she's already not only moving away from kind of Marxism, she's already kind of embracing ordo-liberal thinkers, talking a lot about the need for a regulated free market. Regardless of what you think of the merits of those ideas, I say that only to point out that her transformation intellectually began much earlier than 2023 or even 2015, where it's often dated back to.
And it wasn't all about immigration, basically.
It wasn't, right. It wasn't all about immigration.
But coming forwards actually to 2015, right? Wagenknecht was one of the big critics of Merkel's Wir schaffen das, Willkommenskultur kind of stuff, right?
Yes.
So was that where this trench warfare with the Die Linke started for her? Within Die Linke?
I imagine so. I didn't have a bug in party offices at the time. I think, there's actually sometimes you'll see it on Twitter. Interestingly, when far-right people on social media now try to discredit Sarah Wagenknecht as not really being anti-immigration, they take these pictures from a stunt that the parliamentary group pulled in 2015 where they, not a stunt, that sounds negative, a action, where they all boarded a boat in the Spree wearing life jackets. And it was kind of a PR stunt to draw attention to the plight of migrants in the Mediterranean.
Right.
She went along with that, right? She participated in that action. I think the tension began around that time, I think largely around the realization, and a not false realization on the part of Wagenknecht and people around her, that the mass influx of immigrants, of refugees, would, in a country that has been imposing austerity for decades, lead to distributional conflicts at the local level, and that the left could not limit itself to simply saying everyone is welcome, but had to take on these economic questions and also the economic anxieties that they were going to generate. And I would argue that's kind of, from my reading, I was not involved, but based on, just following it as a journalist and as a member of the party, I would say that's where the fight really crystallized and carried on for a decade after that.
Although it's kind of a zero-sum approach, right? The idea is that there's going to be a conflict about how many benefits you can get. This was true also of Ukrainian refugees and the debate about that with Wagenknecht. But what about the question of opportunity? Because most mainstream economists, not even socialist economists, they would say that, one of Germany's big economic problems is the demographics. It's an older society. If my figures if I'm remembering them right, I think there's 2 workers for every pensioner, which is not great.
Not great, yeah.
And, actually, actually migration is one of the only ways of fixing this huge demographic issue. So, why did people not make that case, or like why? It seems like the whole case was made on a very kind of moralistic level of like we have to be the party of saving people in the Mediterranean, rather than like we should be the party of East German and German renewal through Fachkräfte, through like specialist workers.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great point, and points to a more kind of fundamental issue, I think, with the party's current impasse is the, for lack of a better term, like Wagenknecht wrote her book a couple years ago about the lifestyle left, which is not a term I use. I don't think it's very useful. But there was definitely in the 2010s perhaps not so much in also in the membership, but also in the kind of mid-level of the party apparatus, a large influx of people coming more from what you can either call social movement background or NGO background.
Or activists.
Or activists, sure, yeah. Where I would argue that a real kind of moralism increasingly dominated the tone of the debate in the party. So it became, I think a great example of this is I think this was in 2016 at a party congress when Wagenknecht was, the pie was thrown in her face.
Yeah, like a chocolate
right,
or something.
Exactly. And the idea was...
As a protest because she was seen as a racist.
Right, exactly.
Migration and...
Yeah, and at the, Wagenknecht's positions have developed, and I think, I find, especially this year, some of the rhetorical fire she plays with quite dangerous, but she was not playing with that fire 8 years ago. She was basically saying, I can't exactly remember the debate, but essentially the position was like, there are structural limits to how many people the state can take on, at least within the current fiscal structure, and the left also has to talk about that. We can't just make a moralizing argument, and that was considered racist. She had a pie thrown in her face. You got to assume if those people with the pie were let into the party congress, that there were people in the party that allowed them in and were in on it. I don't know, but I don't know how else you would get into a party congress and get close enough to her that you could throw a pie.
Right.
And I think that reflects kind of a lot of the debate at the time that was very morally charged. Much, honestly, less so than it is today in some ways, because reality is just kind of set in. But there was a...
And because the left has seemingly lost the argument on a lot of
yes.
issues.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Lost the political momentum at
right.
least.
Yeah, at least the momentum.
So you're kind of picking up on something that I find interesting, but also frustrating about the German left. This lifestyle element. It's also sometimes called the subcultural left, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So this is and I sometimes like to frame it as almost a form of left-wing identity politics.
Yeah.
Because it's not class politics. It's not about what relationship you have to the means of production. It's about your identity as a leftist.
Right.
And, we're here in Berlin. We're in Neukölln. There's a lot of these bars and clubs within a couple mile radius of here where they're like, oh, it's a leftist club. Oh, it's a leftist bar, Syndikat, or About Blank, quite infamous for their support of Israel, or position on the Middle East conflict. So, to me, when I actually came here, I thought this was quite interesting. I thought it was kind of cool almost, but I've really shifted my position on this. I think it's not only cringe, but deeply problematic and for political organizing, right? Where does this subcultural left come from? And how does this fit in with the so-called anti-Deutsch movement? Because I have friends who grew up in small towns in Bavaria. They went to leftist youth clubs, and then they were also taught about how great Israel is, for example. And then there are these maybe apocryphal examples of we're doing a leftist youth club meet at the McDonald's because we're in solidarity with the US because they protect the Jewish state. Where does this culture come from? And has there been any kind of reckoning with it?
I don't know. I don't think there has been.
Is it a millennial phenomenon?
I don't think so. I think No, I think millennials are just more annoying, maybe, than the predecessors. But the autonomist left, or post-autonomist left, I guess you would call it, basically comes out of 1968. And, people like Joschka Fischer, the former foreign minister, rather,
Co-founder of the Green Party.
co-founder of the Green Party. But, I mean, just to give one example, but after SDS... So the German is kind of interesting. The German student left and the American student left of the 60s have some similar or interesting similarities. Not only the fact that the main student organization was called SDS in both, although it stood for different things, had different political relations.
Rudi Dutschke was the leader, right?
Rudi Dutschke, who also would have helped found the Greens. He died shortly before, but he was involved in the preparations. SDS as kind of a left-wing social democratic organization that over the course of the 60s radicalizes and basically breaks apart, a bit similar to the SDS in the United States, into various dogmatic Marxist-Leninist organizations, the K-Gruppen, as they're called. You had an equivalent in the United States in the so-called New Communist Movement, and then more of a spontaneist, or Sponti, as it's called in German, wing around people like Joschka Fischer, Rudi Dutschke, etc. And whereas in the United States, and that's where I think the political economy of the countries plays a big real role, by the late 1970s, most of those people in the United States who'd been in communist parties or in the more, kind of spontaneous wing had basically settled down and gotten jobs. Maybe they were academics, maybe they were working in the nonprofit sector, but the overwhelming majority of them just became normal, middle-class people. Whereas in Germany, I think you had a specific situation in many large West German cities where there was just a lot of empty space around, which frankly was also the case in the United States. But in the United States, for various reasons, you did not have the development of this kind of squatter culture.
Right. And there was like more of a racial divide in the US.
Well, yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and many of these 1968ers in the 1970s, not only in West Berlin, I guess is maybe where I know the most about it, but also in Frankfurt.
Hamburg.
Right. All these cities established these kind of left-wing community centers, which originally most of them were really trying to focus on working-class youth. So the students have disappointed us, but there's a whole new generation of young workers, of what's the word? Like Azubis, like people in traineeships, apprentices, who were very much inspired by the radical wave of the late 1960s, and they were looking to carry that into the factories. So that's how Joschka Fischer started politically, and the disappointment with that led to kind of two routes: either the Greens. So you become parliamentary, but you're still alternative, which then very quickly moved to the center, or you persist in this kind of like a radical existence on the fringes of society, but frankly facilitated through social democratically governed cities that were quite tolerant of this. So I think
generous.
And generous, yes, very generous, very tolerant. You could get state subsidies, or you would at least not get evicted. And it created... A lot of people
would be on benefits.
Right, yeah. I mean, you had a similar situation for radical artists in the UK in the 70s, for example.
True.
You just get an arts grant and you hang out for 5 years.
Yeah.
Led to a lot of great
music.
music.
Came from that, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And in Germany, it took the form of these autonome Zentren. And throughout the 1970s and 80s, there was kind of a general consensus of kind of a vaguely revolutionary, vaguely anti-imperialist politics, not necessarily that well defined, but in solidarity with Sandinistas in Nicaragua, with left-wing movements around the world, usually, maybe not always, but usually also with the Palestinians. And that, I think, in many ways, has become the default political socialization for most people most young people looking to get involved in left-wing politics who aren't, for example, in a trade union. So, if you start doing a traineeship at 18, you'll probably get recruited into the young trade union or the trade union youth or whatever. But if you're, middle class, university student, or on your way to university and you're interested in politics, you're probably going to end up in one of these kind of
Yeah.
scenes.
Possibly through Palestine. I think nowadays it's
Nowadays, yeah.
big
yeah.
political.
Sure.
And, you know, I'm 35. Palestine was a big issue when I was at university as well, as was the Iraq War for maybe people of your age.
I'm not that much older than you.
Okay. So, okay, people used to get into politics through this kind of anti-imperialist worldview, right? And that brings me to, where did that start to shift, and where did the German left start to have this very particular viewpoint on the Middle East?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, it's you can point to like real splits and debates in 1989, 1990. Beginning around a Maoist group, actually. I'm not going to be able to remember which one, but I believe it was the Kommunistische Bund Westdeutschlands. But one of these various Marxist-Leninist parties, one of the few that still existed at that point, around German reunification. So, you know, you had this kind of resurgence of right-wing violence in the East, and also in general, just a fear that was not only a German fear, but was shared by many realist thinkers in the foreign policy establishment across the West, that unified Germany would just become too strong and uncontainable, that there was something intrinsic in the German national mentality or in the German state that would lead to renewed conquest.
Even Margaret Thatcher said it.
Well, right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. There's a very widespread kind of belief, and large parts of the left identified with that or took up that belief and opposed German reunification. So that's where the slogan Nie wieder Deutschland comes from.
Probably the best slogan for the anti-Deutsch ever came up with.
And from there, you get these, that's where people like Jutta Dittfurt first rose to prominence, who is, I'm sure she's blocked both of us by now on Twitter, but is kind of a very prominent one of these left-wing friends of Israel. Magazines like Bahamas, which is now, I would say now is just an openly far-right magazine, but at the time was ostensibly a left-wing magazine. I remember the first issue I ever saw, I had an article, a critical Marxist defense of the English Defense League.
It's just, the English Defense League, for those who don't know, are like a far-right hooligan group against Muslims, right? So it's just weird.
It's just weird. And it's rooted in, I would argue, a actually very Stalinist, in the sense of a Stalinist conception of historical progress, idea that history proceeds in, so this is the theoretical justification it was given. If you talk to the average pro-Israel left-wing kid in Berlin, they're not going to share this view or probably even know about it. But the original argument put forward was that history proceeds in stages, and socialism can only come after bourgeois capitalism and democracy. And Israel is already a bourgeois democracy in a largely semi-feudal region of the world. So we need to support this capitalist formation as a step towards socialism, right? That was kind of like the pseudo-Marxist theoretical justification given for it, then amplified by this kind of notion that does have some very real historical grounding, that Israel is the only state of the Jews or for the Jews, and Germany as
a special responsibility.
Right, as a special responsibility. And I think those two arguments kind of fused. I would say never became hegemonic on the left, but certainly in the 90s, from what I gather from reading and speaking to people who were around back then, was a very real and significant component of this kind of autonomous scene culture, which in the 90s was still much bigger than it is today. Berlin, Leipzig, Halle, many of these cities had a lot more bars and clubs and infrastructure than they do now, and the groups were also bigger. So actually all of that is minuscule compared to 15, 20 years ago, but the presence, their intellectual presence, they also oftentimes would organize capital reading groups. So they oftentimes offered an intellectual life that, especially after the collapse of the Communist Party in 1989, did not exist in many other ways. So they became a very interesting first address for a lot of young people looking to learn more about Marxist ideas. And then they got this very specific kind of warped idea of what Marxism is. It's a lot of Adorno, it's a lot of value theory, and it's weirdly support for Israel although actually we reject the existence of nations and nation states,
Yeah.
except for this one. Like one slogan is like Israel until communism,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Yeah.
Or, I remember reporting on a demo in Leipzig a couple of years ago, and they have these like slogans which they print out, and I think are also allowed by police. And one of them was like, kein Gott, kein Staat, kein Patriarchat. So no God, no state, no patriarchy. And the next one was like, fight for Zionism. And it's like, wait, Zionism is like a state ideology,
Right.
Like
Yeah.
that's intrinsic to it. They want a Jewish state. You can find that good or bad, but you can't have that and a no state. Although I will actually say that there are some people in the pro-Palestinian movement who have the same similar kind of ideas.
Sure.
In in the sense of like no nations, but then free Palestine. It's like we can be fair here and say that there's a contradiction at the heart of both of those.
Oh, I agree.
And maybe even that like people want nations, and that is not intrinsically bad in and of itself. Although we can also remain critical there.
Sure.
And probably should. So this particular view of, I mean, you mentioned Adorno. So how much of this stuff, like anti-Semitism, is actually based on Adorno, or is it just a complete bastardization from your understanding?
I don't think you can blame Adorno for the Anti-Deutsch. I think one thing that the Anti-Deutsch take from Adorno in terms of affect is a general alienation from their own society, or also a focus on the cultural industry and interrogating the surface phenomenon of bourgeois capitalist society, and a deep pessimism in terms of the political potential of the German working class, or of the working classes in general, which obviously for Adorno has a very specific origin in witnessing Nazism and witnessing the strongest workers' movement in history, at least at the time, essentially give up without a fight. That same experience, I think, is also a large reason why the Stasi were so pervasive in East Germany.
Because they just kind of collaborated with the rulers, effectively.
Well, I think a lack of trust in the domestic population in their ability to fight for socialism, right? I mean, obviously very different outcomes in East and West, but a fundamental skepticism because of the defeat of 1933 and the German working class's failure to rise up in revolution, which, most leftists still thought was going to happen late into the 1930s, that, this will go on for a couple years, but the proudest workers' movement on earth isn't going to allow itself to be crushed by this Austrian midget. And that didn't happen. Yeah. So I think that those are commonalities, that kind of general and really lack of interest in political action, a lack of belief that the majority of people can be mobilized and convinced of kind of an egalitarian socialist perspective. And so then you retreat to the academy, you retreat into your Freiräume, and
they
you
have
analyze.
kind of done that, though, haven't they? To a certain extent. I think the anti-Deutsch, so-called anti-Deutsch, have like kind of pursued a dual strategy here, because they have retreated to the academy. Apparently, if you're in Frankfurt universities in Frankfurt, there's plenty of anti-Deutsch reading groups, Adorno, all of this. But then they've also pursued a strategy which I would describe as somewhat Trotskyist, as this march through the institutions. And I think that's where they've actually been successful, because they are very pervasive and powerful within the media, within the culture desks, specifically of left-wing newspapers, ostensibly left-wing newspapers, and also, more conservative bourgeois newspapers. They seem to have realized that they can't actually... They don't have much to say politically, so they frame it through the lens of politics and, of course, or of culture, sorry. And of course, their idea of culture seems to just be Antisemitismuskritik, like critique of anti-Semitism. And I have my perspective on this one. It's something I've kind of encountered quite a lot. I actually feel like they have inverted some of the ideas of National Socialism. So rather than seeing Jewish power everywhere, they see anti-Semitism everywhere. It's this same paranoid mentality, and it's to me a sign of reaction. And actually, what we should have, if we were having a true kind of Adornoite perspective, would be the dialectic. So we would have the Nazism paranoia, anti-Semitic paranoia, would have the reactionary anti-Deutsch paranoia. There should be some kind of point in the middle. Is that somewhere that we're getting to with the German left? Is there a move away from this anti-Deutsch, ultra-Deutsch lunacy?
Well, I mean, I think honestly, I mean, I'm sure, you would have to, if you looked into the biographies of the 300, like most the journalists with the widest reach, I'm sure you'd find that a decent number of them at some point were maybe somehow socialized in an anti-Deutsch context. But I think that the diffusion of this kind of position is not so much the result of any concerted effort, but rather inertia and the absence of a strong counter perspective, and in many ways a lack of courage on large parts of the left who don't share that perspective. I think if you were to look at the German left, people who identify as anti-Deutsch, it's going to be a pretty small number of people. I mean, they're groups, most of their groups that don't exist anymore. Or,
they don't call themselves that. They call themselves antisemitismuskritisch or solidarisch.
Sure.
Yeah.
But if you look at 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there were a lot of organizations calling themselves like Anti-Deutsche Antifa or something like that. Most of these groups have ceased to exist, but their presence for a long time and, kind of the ever omnipresent accusations of anti-Semitism, I think have intimidated a lot of people into simply not wanting to talk about the question, not knowing very much about it, kind of like a willing ignorance to avoid having uncomfortable conversations. And I think what October 7th did was kind of sent all of that into overdrive, because you have obviously a war crime and a cruel and horrible attack on civilians. And if you view it in isolation, well, yeah, okay, well, that's a horrible, unprecedented war crime.
No question about it.
But it gave a lot of ammunition, not only to the anti-Deutsch, but really to the German establishment, which is attached to Israel for its own reasons, to kind of go full bore and portray the Palestinians as, terrorists and, barbarians and et cetera, et cetera. And you had a left.
And supporters in Germany as well.
Right, yeah. And you had a left that, was not self-confident enough, probably didn't even have a clear analysis to begin with, to contextualize what was happening. Or especially around the days after the attack, using the word context would immediately provoke accusations of anti-Semitism. And I think that really shifted the momentum in the debate to the side of the Friends of Israel, so to speak, that you could not speak about the 20 years of the siege. It's the siege of Gaza, the 75 years of occupation of Palestine. You could only talk about October 7th.
And you had to start every sentence with, I condemn Hamas.
Exactly. And to some extent, you still have to. But prior to October 7th, my feeling was actually that the dynamic was shifting in the other direction, that more and more people on the left, it wasn't going to be the number one issue that anyone took up, but more and more of the German left had moved to a position of Israel as the occupier. Israel is in many ways a far-right society. Doesn't mean that Palestinian population also doesn't have problematic views. Every society is very contradictory and mixed.
Sure.
And I think October 7th really halted that dynamic and made a lot of people just scared to say anything. Now, I mean, if we look at, polling, majority of Germans are not in support of giving weapons to Israel, or not in support of what is happening in Gaza and in the West Bank and in Lebanon now and in Syria now. But there is still a loud minority within the left that is very pro-Israel, that continues to accuse anyone who disagrees of anti-Semitism. And I think it will be a while until that really shifts, because you've got a loud, militant, pro-Palestine movement in Germany. Still fairly small in terms of overall numbers, I think, I would argue, but nevertheless, very
Although there have
visible.
been some very big demonstrations.
It's true, there have been some very big demonstrations, but things will only really shift when the middle of society begins to move. And even if the middle of society might, when asked, disagree with what's happening, they've not been, moved to join protests or write letters to their politicians or anything like that. And I think though I don't think that Palestine would win or lose any election. I mean, if you look at like polls, what is the most important issue to you among German voters, like Israel-Palestine is like number 20 or something.
Yeah, sure.
But
it gets some people are like deeply passionate about this issue.
Yeah.
On both sides, you could say.
Right.
Most people care a bit.
Right.
But not that much.
Right. Think it's bad, but also don't want to say anything and maybe be accused of anti-Semitism at work or, whatever.
Or end up in Riaz statistics, right? Because that there was a case, actually, I think in Saxony or Thuringia, where someone said, they were against Israeli settlements, and that ended up in.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's which is almost like this Stasi kind of esque mentality, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
I think we can draw some continuities there. Maybe it's just German ontology. Who knows?
Well, Wolfgang Streeck, the retired sociologist, he wrote an article just a couple days ago for the journal, I think it's the Journal of European Social Theory, commenting on another article about the anti-Semitism measures in Germany. And he used a phrase that I really liked about the well-honed German talent for anticipating what the state wants before the state even wants it. And I think there is an element of that. There is kind of a preemptive acquiescence on the part of large segments of the population. I don't want to draw any direct historical continuities, but it does seem to be like maybe a characteristic of German society. And I think just the absence of, Die Linke on paper, along with Sarah Wagenknecht's party, have, I would say, been the most vocal about opposing what's going on in Palestine. But
there's Mera 24.
Well, yes, but
right?
Parties represented in parliament that
Sure.
get television coverage, put it that way.
And so this is the question that I have. Like, it's quite a small movement for Palestine, but the people are very passionate. Aren't those the kind of people, young, diverse, engaged? Aren't they the people you want in your party rather than these East German bureaucrats, effectively?
Well, I mean, I would say
Or a bit of both.
It takes all types, right? I think. I would say this. I think that Die Linke's political survival does not depend on Palestine, but I think a somewhat more muscular response, without going over the top, but a more steadfast and clear line on what's happening in Palestine would help it out a little bit, kind of in the way that like Palestine didn't lose the election for Kamala Harris, but it certainly lost her Dearborn, and that may have lost her Michigan. You can see it as one brick in the wall, the crumbling wall. And I think you can make a similar case for Palestine. Like the Palestine movement, which obviously I support, I think also shoots itself in the foot every once in a while in terms of their messaging. Oftentimes the banners and demands will be in English, for example, which I understand there's a lot of international people involved in the movement, but you are conducting politics in a German-speaking country. It would make sense to speak in German, and I think that there's also a tendency, not only in Germany, around the world, and not only in the Palestine movement, but just in general, to focus on the most radical demand rather than the widest demand or most acceptable demand. So I think something like free Gaza, free speech, against what's happening in Gaza and against the repression, against people protesting against it, attracts a much wider segment of the population than I remember when one of the FU occupations began. I saw they had a big banner that said decolonize feminism. And I think, I'm
What does
not
that mean?
Well, that was my first question, but regardless of that, I mean, that's a conversation to be had.
Definitely.
In some space, maybe not when you're trying to win over the majority of the population
Who
don't
might not even
necessarily
know what feminism is, definitely don't know what
and
colonization is.
maybe don't speak English, right?
Right.
So that I think that's just a tactical mistake, a strategic mistake that the movement is making. That is nothing new. I was in the Occupy movement. I was in many iterations of the Palestine movement. But my first political experience was in the Iraq War movement. I was not in university yet, but I was getting close.
Okay.
And I feel like in the anti-war movement at the time in the United States, there was a strategic decision to focus on troops out now and not smash U.S. imperialism, dismantle the security apparatus. Of course, 80% of those of us organizing felt that way, but we wanted to get a majority on side, including a lot of Democrats, to oppose the war. And I think that, unfortunately, is not happening at the moment. And it's kind of like they're mutually reinforcing trends. So
although you weren't successul particularly with
no,
your
we did not end the war. It's true.
Right?
No, well, we did get Barack Obama elected.
That worked out great.
Well, right, yeah. Politics usually sucks. For the left. But I think there's kind of a mutually reinforcing dynamic there. Is that the left, or the left party and large parts of the established institutional left don't want to touch Palestine. Large parts of the Palestine movement put on a kind of radical aesthetic that increasingly isolates them, rather than what I would like to see, which is. I don't think Die Linke should become a one-issue party around Palestine, but it wouldn't hurt to hold a speech once a week, for example, or, for example, introduce a motion like left parties have done in many European countries that the German government should recognize Palestine as a state. These are things that have not happened that I think would be useful.
And you can't really be accused of being anti-Semitic for wanting a Palestinian state, can you? I mean, you would be.
Well, you would be. Yeah, you would be. But
it's not very believable, It's not like you're backing Palestinian military resistance, which would lead to people's death. You're saying like we want a state.
Exactly. These kind of
Pretty
positions
moderate demand.
Positions that are frankly uncontroversial across most of European social democracy.
I mean, even I think Poland recognizes Palestine
True,
as a
yeah.
state.
Although I think they did that when they were still a socialist country. Don't know if the government would make that decision now if they could revisit.
So, what's your take on Mera 25 in that case?
I mean, I have a lot of sympathy. Certainly, I have a great respect for Yanis Varoufakis. I think he's one of the most intellectually and morally consistent public figures in European public life. I also think that if you compare Mera's program to, for example, the European left's program for the European elections, it was much more systematic and thought out, durchdekliniert, so to speak. And really put forward a clear idea of how you could reform the EU from the left, which is something I think most of the left fails to do. I'm just not convinced that there's really a European public to recruit to that project. And I think that's one of the fundamental problems of any European political initiative is that Europe is a bureaucratic institution. It is not a public sphere. It's divided by 27 nation states, cultures, some 20 languages or whatever. And the amount of people who really identify with Europe is fairly small to begin with. And secondly, overwhelmingly middle and upper class. And I think the proposition of a socialist Europeanist party is admirable, but is falling on deaf ears because there's just not a public there that's interested in that message.
And that's actually why Volt are doing the same thing more successfully.
Slightly more successfully, yeah, because I think that's the more natural address for people who feel European.
Right.
Because it's
technocratic liberalism.
Yeah, and you need to be able to enjoy freedom
with a
of
Europhile
movement.
kind of
Right,
group.
yeah. But to be able to enjoy freedom of movement in Europe, you have to have enough money to travel. To do Erasmus, I mean, okay, I know Erasmus, there's scholarships, etc., but you have to be in university.
Sure.
To do an internship in another country, you need to have a college education and be moving in that kind of direction professionally. So I think for a lot of people, it's just not really appealing. And if you think about the tens of millions of migrant workers in Europe who are European, who are working in slaughterhouses, on farms. I'm sure Mera 25 has a message for them and would like to reach them, but you're not going to reach them campaigning in a few large cities.
And I also have a bit of a problem with Mera's name, for example. So it's actually Greek.
Right.
Meaning morning, but it's like an acronym for the European Realistic Disobedience Front, which sounds like something coming out of 2000s Adbusters sort of territory, right? So I know some cool activists working for Mera for sure, but like there's another problem they have in Germany, which someone explained to me, which I found quite interesting. Actually having a Greek name and trying to get Turkish votes.
I didn't even think of that.
Not because they're associated with Varoufakis.
Sure.
I think a lot of the people involved are actually Greek, right? So even in Germany, have some of the prominent people have Greek backgrounds. So, but they are a party which sort of lent into Gaza as a political issue during the last election, not as much as maybe the Gaza list in Austria, but they didn't do that well, I would say.
Exactly. I think they did marginally worse than they did last time around, which I think speaks to what I was saying, that as much as morally I think Gaza is maybe the most important issue of our time, it's not decisive electorally in this country. And thus, I wouldn't, if I were dictating Die Linke's policy, I would not say, let's talk about Gaza all the time. I think that would really backfire. But we could talk about it more than we do. I mean, if we're primarily mobilizing to get our government to stop sending weapons to Israel, then we want to bring as many people on board as possible. And that's going to mean a lot of people who believe in the two-state solution. Sure, we can talk for hours about how Israel has systematically undermined the two-state solution since the Oslo Accords. I have no illusions about that. But the average person has not spent hours reading about the last 40 years of the conflict. And you want to bring them on board and then have the conversation with them when they're on board. But if you lead with things like decolonize or the one-state solution, I think you lose a lot of people who, at least in terms of their gut feeling, sympathize with you, but aren't informed enough or aren't well-educated, just aren't informed enough and haven't thought about it enough to get on board with, here this year at the Columbia occupation, Norman Finkelstein, very well-known Jewish American scholar of Israeli politics. He gave a speech at the occupation about how he basically talked about his experience in the Vietnam War movement and how he regrets how often they chose maximalist slogans that alienated people.
Right.
And saying
he was a Maoist at the time.
He was
as well,
a Maoist,
wasn't he?
yes.
He wrote quite a good essay about being an ex-Maoist.
Oh, yeah. But, in this speech, he says the slogan that we should be focusing on is free Gaza and free speech. You have a majority in this country that agrees with you on that. We should not alienate them by chanting things like from the river to the sea. I don't know if I agree with him on that particular slogan, but as a general impetus, I agree with him.
Kind of undermining the point about free speech if you can't use one of the most widespread slogans, which does not come from Hamas.
Right, of course it doesn't come from Hamas.
Yeah.
But, his point was just we need a broad, acceptable slogan.
Sure.
He finishes, you watch this video on YouTube, he finishes his speech, polite applause, and then someone grabs the microphone and just starts screaming, "From the river!" And you're like, well, okay, I guess no one got the point.
There's this question of disruption, right? Like how it's the same with the climate protesters, the so-called Klimakleber. Like how much does disruption actually help your political? It's this theater idea of politics. What do you think about that as like more of a traditional leftist on some issues?
Well, I mean, I think there can be a time and a place for it. It can, you used to generate a lot of publicity to polarize the public debate. I think when it becomes ritualized the way, for example, Last Generation has done it, it becomes pretty counterproductive. And I think especially when you're doing things like stopping people from getting to work, as justified as that all may be, given the climate crisis, I think you probably alienate more people than you win over. I don't think it's, in general, I don't think it's very effective. Though I do think certain spectacular actions can be both useful and justified. I'm not dogmatic in that sense, but I'm for mass politics to the extent that that is possible in our horribly atomized social media mediated world, where people just sit and watch stuff on their phones. I think our goal still has to be mobilizing as many people as possible, getting them organized politically, making them understand that they can assert their interests if they work together. And for that, you need to focus on what brings people together and not what divides them.
And is that is that best done through a party, through workplaces?
I mean, I continue to think that what we basically need as socialists is we need a political party that kind of, in classical parlance, kind of unites the advanced. So the people who are most politically in tune and have a somewhat clear idea of what kind of economic and political system we want to get to. The avant-garde would you call it?
Vanguardists, yeah.
You're right, vanguard. Sorry, not avant-garde. But, same thing. And then we need broad mass organization, especially in the workplace, where in the terms of like working people, have a powerful tool in their hands, and that by striking, they can shut down parts of the economy and exert a lot more pressure on the ruling elite than just a protest can. And I mean, I continue to believe those are kind of the two central mechanisms or institutions of left-wing politics: building a voice, or not only a voice, but building organization explicitly for a socialist society in Parliament, but also outside of Parliament, and rooting that in the institutions of the labor movement, as weak as they may be compared to 50 or 100 years ago, because that is the only place where we can potentially generate the kind of social power we need to not only win an election, but then also prevail in the ensuing standoff with capital, as we've seen every time a left-wing government wins power by democratic means. Mm-hmm. Whether France 1981, Greece 2015, you can win an election, but if capital boycotts your economy, you're brought to your knees pretty quickly. And so that's why we need not just a political party, but really, for lack of a more eloquent term, something like combat organizations rooted in the workplace.
In the workplace, but is this where these kind of subcultural or spaces, left-wing spaces, could play a role? Or are you more skeptical about Blank's role in the revolution?
Yeah, I'm pretty skeptical of that also because I think, these places just exist less and less. Even just in the 15 years, or I guess it's been 17 years now since I moved to Berlin, the number of these sorts of left-wing spaces has declined dramatically. There were a lot more squats when I moved here, and there were a lot more squats 15 years before I moved here than there were 15 years ago. And they're shrinking because Berlin is now a wealthy, desirable place for investors and middle-class people looking to buy apartments. So there's just not space for those institutions anymore. And we can bemoan that fact. We can regret that fact. I think it has had a negative impact on cultural life in the city, absolutely. But they're not coming back. And
it's not just the explicitly left-wing ones which are going as well, right?
Anything that can't make a quick buck, basically, unless they were lucky enough to cut some deal with the city and they own their building. But those are few and far between at this point. And I also would argue that in my own experience, when I was more of an activist, when you take on, whether it's, I have plenty of friends at university who kind of started like intentional vegas, like intentional living spaces where we share everything and everything's basisdemokratisch, or, a left-wing cafe or bar or club. It kind of eats up a lot of your time that you can't be spending on other politics. So I tend to think I wouldn't say it does harm in that sense, but it can really remove you from actual politics.
For sure. One of the first times I spent in Berlin, I was staying in a house project. So not a full squat, but it was one of these sort of left-wing spaces. And it was, the amount of plenums that these people have, these meetings
unbearable
and stuff, like that it would be full-time political action if you're really involved, and it's seen as like a good thing to be really involved.
Right.
But I actually don't know. I guess this is ironic to say as a podcaster, but I don't know how much like talking about stuff, especially in your VG, is a political action.
Oh, I agree. I mean,
Especially talking about like who does the dishes
Right.
in this particular way. And there are always political elements there. And it's almost always, women and Flinter who do more and stuff like that, for sure. That should be talked about. But talking about it isn't in itself like a significant political action.
Oh, I agree. And it can take on real narcissistic dimensions. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, what happens in your flat in vetting only affects you and whoever else is in the flat. And to devote hours and hours of your time to passionate arguments about the house dynamics, frankly, I would just rather live by myself or with my partner or with a friend.
And I think that's what happens in the end, right? People come in very kind of idealistic, and then they just give up because they get burnt out by like internal like house project politics.
Yeah.
Because also there are sometimes some like really crazy people involved in these situations.
Yes.
Like narcissists, like.
Well, and I think that's one of the downsides of the amount of material infrastructure that the kind of subcultural left has had in the last decades, which we also, I think, it's worth mentioning that the growth of Die Linke and of its foundation, there was a Luxembourg Stiftung, there was no direct subsidy of these scenes, that by no means, but spaces and resources became accessible or available that did not exist prior, and kind of kept these kind of safe spaces. I don't mean to use a pejorative right-wing term, but kind of safe spaces for left-wing people open, and those don't necessarily attract the kinds of people who are going to go out and organize a successful political campaign, but rather people who are looking for friends and looking to belong, or and this is true for myself as well. This is not a dig at anyone else. Just middle class people who you called it identity-based left. You could call it left identitarians. Young middle class people who like really want to believe in something and be a part of something, and that's okay. Those people have been a major component of every political movement. But when they then move inward, and it's not about going out into the public and interacting, engaging with normal people, but rather it's I'm setting up a commune with 20 of my friends in Kreuzberg.
Or we have like internal jokes about Rosa and Carl.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's fine, but keep that in your friendship.
Yeah.
And I think that those lines blur for a lot of people, and it creates a kind of a insular and defensive political culture.
And this actually brings me round to my last question, which is, why is the German left so white compared to the Democrats, compared to Corbynism, which I was an activist for back in the day, and it was a very diverse movement. And then I came to the left here, and I was like, initially, oh, it's cool, they've all got tattoos, we can like smoke joints in like these left-wing spaces. And then I realized like, yeah, everyone's white. And when I started to dig a bit deeper, it's like, okay, everyone's really pro-Israel, and like they don't have any brown friends, which is just bizarre to me as a Brit.
It's
even a middle class one.
I mean, it's funny you describe that because my experience is a little bit similar, I would say. Surely the left could be doing a better job reaching out to people of color, but I think you have to look at the structure of German society as a whole, because in general, Germany, despite having, 10, 15 million, maybe more people with like kind of non-white backgrounds, or at least migrant backgrounds, German political life is still quite white, and German society is still quite segregated. So even if you don't have the same degree of spatial segregation the way you might in the United States, you have a lot more cultural segregation in terms of community life. And I think that's reflected in the left as well. You also have, at least among Turks, as the largest minority group, you have a very strong
national identity,
but also migrant political life, right? So there is a also declining, but nevertheless still large, significant Turkish left. So if you're a young Turkish person in somewhere in North Rhine-Westphalia, you're probably going to join DDIF, which is, I forgot what it stands for, but it's kind of like a left-wing youth organization tied to some Turkish Communist Party. You might join, even in Berlin, there are various kind of Außenposten of Turkish left-wing organizations. So there is a Turkish political life that perhaps keeps some Turkish people or a lot of Turkish people out of the
Although couldn't that
the
have
German
maybe
left.
been fused? Like, couldn't that have there been efforts to do that? Because to me, that seems like more of a positive than
Yeah,
a
well, I
challenge.
mean, a lot of the Turkish politicians that you do see in Die Linke come from that background.
Right.
But yeah, there's just more political segregation in the country that I think is reflected in the left, and then it doesn't help when you have the kind of situations like you described, that the left is in many ways very middle class and very moralistic. I think if you were
Very German.
very German, yeah. I mean, I think if you were to compare like IG Metall members at a factory in Wolfsburg or Salzgitter, it's going to be a lot less white than the local Linke chapter, right? Because that's one place where people do mix. They have to mix at work. But outside of work, Germans still often live quite segregated lives, I would say, in the left. Kind of reproduces that because most of them are products of that life.
Although I feel like the left hasn't, and maybe no German party has really seen the potential of like having these people as voters.
Yeah.
And of like, it's something you kind of expect the Greens to do, of like this progressive idea of of like bringing together migrants and progressive people, and then queer people and stuff. And you get it in, I think, let's say Friedrichshain-Kreuzberg Greens or something, but
Sure,
but
yeah.
not in any party except, and I think this is ironic, I would say the party with the most politicians of a migrant background has to be the BSV.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just going to say the BSV is the exception. And that was also, I mean, I would very much imagine, I have no data, but I would imagine if you were to look at the membership level, it would be much wider than the top-heavy part. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of the irony when the party split is
Right.
the narrative was...
Anti-migrant split is
Right.
mostly migrants.
Mostly migrants, yeah.
People with migrant families.
Which also testifies to the fact that like migrant people are not a monolith.
And not always pro-migration.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's not only that, but they're also not all poor or working class. I mean, I think that Gaza did play a role in the disproportionate support among Muslims for Wagenknecht or for Wagenknecht's party. But I think also just the fact that a lot of Turks are small business owners. Sarah Wagenknecht's politics appeal to that. They're not necessarily the most culturally progressive on many questions. Sarah Wagenknecht's kind of waffling on a lot of those questions is appealing to them. There's no racism, but there's also no like really hard identity politics. And yeah, a lot of them are not necessarily pro-migration.
And, if you look at history and contemporary Turkish politics, a lot of them don't like Arabs that much.
Also true.
Right.
Yeah, sure. I mean, and that's, I think that's one, we were talking about the party at the very beginning of this interview. And I think for me, one very, not decisive moment, but I think one experience where I increasingly felt like, at least parts of the party that I'm a member of had kind of lost touch with reality were the Unteilbar demonstrations in 2018.
I remember that one.
Which were actually started by the far left. They were an initiative of the Rote Hilfe, which was essentially a subtle swipe at Wagenknecht. I'm not sure if Wagenknecht was actually the occasion for the demonstration, but the slogan was "Social rights are indivisible." Like migration, class struggle. This is all one fight, right? And it was a very large demonstration in Berlin, like 300,000 people, and the buzz around the left in Berlin was that okay, this is our movement. This is our Corbyn moment. We had 300,000 people on the streets for like a world without capitalism and without borders. But I looked around in my social circle, which was, a bit less hard left and a bit more petty bourgeois, perhaps, or not more petty bourgeois, because the left is just as petty bourgeois, but a little bit more conscious of its own class status. And plenty of my friends who vote for the Greens, who vote for the SPD, even the CDU, were also at the demonstration because they saw it as just, kind of a manifestation against racism, which they, is something you want to be a part of. But there was this reading on large parts of the left that this was the beginning of some radical wave against the far right and against capitalism. I think they just fundamentally misread the situation. Most people, just because they came from extremely difficult conditions, just because, even if they had to cross the Mediterranean in a boat and nearly lost their lives, they come here with all of the same weird, contradictory ideas and political positions that they had back home. And their ethnic or cultural identity, the fact that it's not white and German, doesn't mean that they're automatically allies of the left. And just being against racism doesn't make you an ally of the left. And I think there was and there continues to be a problem among large parts of the German left that they almost fetishize or idealize kind of subaltern identities. Also because they're probably not actually interacting with many people of that identity, which makes it easier to do. And not realizing that no matter what culture you're from, no matter what gender you identify as, people still have very contradictory ideas. And the historical answer of the left has always been, we're different in many ways, but we have common material interests against a small group of people at the top who have different interests. And it's on that basis that you try to rally people. And I think many parts of the German left have kind of sought shortcuts around that kind of fundamental insight, which basically means that if you accept that premise, if you kind of accept the traditional Marxian, Marxist premise of politics, well, then there are no shortcuts. You can have a big demonstration. You can win an election. But if that's not paired with really building, I think in modern activist parlance, you might call it capacity, right? But if you're not building organizations that are rooted in society and can, really make shut shit down, so to speak, when the time comes, then you won't get past these kind of these flash in the pan big events that then nothing follows from.
So we're learning here for the first time that a big protest doesn't win the revolution, and that the solo poly hijabi black amputee is not the revolutionary class. Thank you very much.
They could belong to it.
Of course. Thanks very much, Lauren Balhorn, for a really great conversation on the left and its future in Germany.
Thanks for having me.